Welcome to Awesome Movie Year, the podcast where we take a look back at an awesome year for movies, which is every year. My name is Josh Bell, film critic and writer, and I'm joined by my co-host.
I'm Jason Harris, filmmaker, comedian, and I'm cool with the gangsters, the groovies, the religious crowd, the soul crowd, and the hippies.
Your intros just get longer and longer each time, I feel like. We're just going to have, I'm Jason Harrison. Here's the plot of this movie that we're talking about.
Well, I mean,
today.
if I had just said gangster in a favela, it would just be like, come on. I'm just...
Yeah, no, do your thing, man.
Josh,
you gotta,
I'm a bird. You got to let me fly, baby.
I would never want to clip your wings.
I'm a wild stallion, Josh. You got to let me run.
Those both could have been intros.
Okay, that's just not Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, though. So, in this season of Awesome Movie Year, we've been talking about the films of 2003, and Jason is giving us a little snapshot there of the scene in the film that we're talking about in this episode, which is our foreign film pick. And it is the Brazilian film City of God by Fernando Meirelles and Katia Lund, and a massive hit in 2003 worldwide, as well as in its native country, and just like a huge pop culture sensation. I don't know. I think, Jason, you said you were, or right before we started, you were looking up some of our previous foreign film episodes, and I don't know, this might be the biggest, popular film that we've done in the foreign
Call You Might from 96 also might be up there. That was like the number one Czech movie, I think, for 50 weeks in a row, right? So, but here we're talking about City of God from Brazil. 2003 is when it hit American shores. It was released in 2002. But hey, we're taking it as we get it, baby.
Right. It was released in 2002 in Brazil. And I think not only in the US, but maybe in other countries outside Brazil, it kind of made its way into the wider world throughout 2003. But yeah, it premiered in 2002 at the Cannes Film Festival. So that was when it first started to reach that wider audience. And it was a huge hit. I mean, especially in the US and outside Brazil, it grossed $30.6 million worldwide, which is a very strong number for a Brazilian film, for a foreign language film, especially here in the US. Its budget was $3.3 million. So obviously very successful making its money back. It was in 2003. So it continued to succeed in Brazil all the way through 2003. In that year, it was the top grossing Brazilian film in Brazil. I don't know that it had any big competition, but in terms of local product, it was the number one grosser there. And it was nominated for 4 Oscars, which I had forgotten about how big it was at the Oscars at the time and another rare thing at the Oscars for a foreign language film to get a nomination outside of just what was at that time the best foreign language film category and is now the best international film. But it was nominated for Best Director for Fernando Meirelles, for Best Adapted Screenplay, for Best Editing, and Best Cinematography. It did not win any of those awards, but just that level of attention, I think, brought it to so many people's attention who maybe would not have heard of it before.
But you're overlooking the big point, Josh.
Which is?
All those Oscar nominations, but not a Best Foreign Film nomination.
Right.
Idiocy
Weird.
on the Oscars,
Yeah.
which we've seen many times before.
We have, and sometimes because of the weird way that category works, and this may be the case for another movie that we've talked about and I don't remember, but sometimes it's the fault of the government of the country because they have to pick a movie to submit. But that was not the case here. Brazil did submit this movie as their official Oscar foreign language film submission, but it was the Academy who neglected to nominate it. So, oops.
Oops, they did it again.
Exactly right.
Brittany was prophetic, Josh.
She was, when she was talking about the Oscars.
I was shocked. I did look back at the Oscars, and I mean, I didn't expect it to win. I mean, look, this was the year Return of the King just trounced everybody, right? But I was kind of surprised that it didn't win cinematography because it is so riveting, the cinematography. Cesar Charlone, and he lost to Master and Commander Russell Boyd, which was a surprise to me there. I just thought that the cinematography was so unique and lively and energetic, and obviously, worked for the story. I really thought it should have won that at least.
Yeah, the cinematography is great. And I mean, I haven't seen Master and Commander since it was out in the theater. And that is a movie that has a weirdly devoted cult following right now. But I'm sure it has nice cinematography. But you're right. In this movie, it has a very distinctive look too. You watch this, and I think it was something that was probably copied a lot after this movie came out, but it really had its own unique style when it first was released.
I agree with you, Josh. The creativity of the shots and how they added to the story was something that, every scene had something else. Like I could watch this movie again this week and learn something else by the framing, the storytelling, and the technical wizardry behind this one.
Yeah, I mean, and the glimpse that it gives you. I mean, obviously for us as Americans, more so than Brazilian audiences, but just the glimpse that it gives you into this whole other world that you're not familiar with, and the visuals are as much a part of that as anything, because even just what's going on in the background and the perspective that we're getting of this area that we've never seen before. I mean, it really captures that even aside from the story.
One thing I really loved was how they kind of changed up the look or the feel depending on what part of the story they were telling.
Right. Yeah. As the time period progresses, they give it its own look. So very impressive. But of course, it didn't have Russell Crowe, so you can see why.
Or Russell Boyd.
Oh yeah, there you go. So this movie was widely acclaimed around the world. It was very, very well reviewed by critics. Roger Ebert had it as his number 2 movie of 2002, actually. So he presumably saw it at Cannes and put it on his list that year, although it wasn't released in the US until the following year. But he was a huge fan. He said, City of God churns with furious energy as it plunges into the story of the slum gangs of Rio de Janeiro. Breathtaking and terrifying, urgently involved with its characters, it announces a new director of great gifts and passions, Fernando Meirelles. Remember the name. The film has been compared with Scorsese's Goodfellas, and it deserves the comparison. City of God does not exploit or condescend, does not pump up its stories for contrived effect, does not contain silly and reassuring romantic sidebars, but simply looks with a passionately knowing eye at what it knows. And I know there were a lot of references to Scorsese in reviews, especially to Gangs of New York, which I think must have come out around the same time in the US as this. And I think those are justified reference points. Jason, you're the Scorsese expert here.
Yeah, I would think Mean Streets and Goodfellas more than that. I wonder though, I'm not saying it exploits, but it definitely gives the gangster not to say they don't all get their comeuppance, but they are treated as heroes. That's the kind of premise of the whole movie, how this is the fable of these gangsters and we're telling it over generations
Right,
here.
right. So, well, what's interesting to me is that sentiment that Ebert expresses in his review is essentially the opposite of what the critics of the movie or the people who were negative about the movie expressed. And still, overwhelmingly, this is a movie that got positive response from critics and from audiences. But there were definitely a handful of people who were not on board with it. And I think it was exactly that perspective that you were just expressing, Jason, about sort of the glorification of this milieu or whatever, or of exploiting these characters in a certain way is what they talked about. So and I will get to that in one moment. But the next review I have is another positive response. It is Stephen Hunter in the Washington Post, who said, the movie is conceived as a kind of anecdotal history. It is derived from a huge novel by a survivor, an escapee from the place, of one of the world's previously impenetrable, blasphemed zones. It rolls across the decades, charting the rise and fall of petty empires, the brief supernova of gangster superstardom, the overturning of an older order by a yet meaner, more ruthless younger one. These events are lit up here and there by little spurts of recognizable behavior, even love. It is a young man's movie. It adores action, swagger, local color, eccentricity, machismo, stupidity. Meirelles just can't stop telling stories, and he can't stop reveling in the goopy mud of bad behavior as it plays out in the swamp of heart and city. So the result is a contradiction, a joyous film about murder. And I think he's getting to that a little, even though this is a very positive review, but that as much as this movie is entertaining and stylish, you do kind of maybe feel a bit uneasy about what it's celebrating at certain points.
I mean, you know, Scorsese, Tarantino, right? David O. Russell. We've seen the stylization of gangster movies for probably much longer than that, even, right? So I just don't buy into that. This is his way of telling a story, and it's our job as an audience. Like, you're not going to go and be like, "Hey, that looked cool. I think I'll go be a gangster now," right? You know,
Right.
you're just
I don't think anyone's saying that.
I just think, I mean, the look is so much of the appeal of this movie. I mean, the story, I really like it, and I love the kind of intersecting tales that he's able to weave and the unique way of telling those stories. But the look really heightens this movie. If he went and tried to shoot it like, say, Gus Van Sant shot Elephant, then the movie wouldn't be nearly as effective, right?
Right. And I agree. I'm not necessarily with those criticisms. And I think one of those things is, like you mentioned, the glorification or presenting gangsters in a stylish, entertaining way is a long, long film tradition going back to Scorsese. I mean, going back earlier than that, even. And I think part of this is because we're used to that. We're used to seeing American films about American criminals, and we understand sort of the reality of it versus the fiction of it. But maybe because we've never seen this particular setting before, as foreigners, we look at it like, oh, this needs to be some sort of like serious anthropological study because I don't know, because it's foreign, and it's almost weirdly condescending to have that perspective, because these are just the same gangsters that we see in Scorsese movies, or in, the rise of, around maybe a little earlier than this, like in the 90s, of hip hop influenced gangster movies or whatever. It's all on that same spectrum, I think.
Well, I think you bring up a good point. I would say you're right. I think a lot of it is that the criticism is coming from a place of not knowing. You know, it's not. This takes place in a favela, which is historically a very poor neighborhood. It's literally the government set up these neighborhoods to kind of move poor people out there. So that is a difference between something like this and Goodfellas, where it's all glamour, or Casino, right? Where these guys are racking hundreds of thousands of dollars on their moves every day, and they're in the clubs and in the fancy cars, all that stuff. So, but I also think that's what's so effective is you're seeing this at a street level, right? And then to go on with that, I think something else that really was showcased in the Benny going away party scene is like just the rhythm, like you think of Carnival and the music and the pulsating rhythms and the drums, and like there's a rhythm to the way of life there. And I feel like he kind of captured that with the way he shot this. Like there's a musicality to it, and I think we can't deny that. There's a shot where he's kind of bathed in the colors of the Brazilian flag, and I was just like, man, that's just so good. And I don't think many viewers would notice that because as Americans, we're not really accustomed to that, right? But yeah, I think he really makes use of his culture here in a very positive manner to tell these stories.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that's why I'm thinking also of not, I mean, Scorsese and that kind of stuff, but also that 90s wave that maybe was started with like Boys in the Hood and movies that were influenced by that did take us into sort of the American equivalent of these poorer neighborhoods, marginalized people, and the gangsters that came out of there. And I think, again, that's a very well-known sort of movie subgenre for us here in America at this point, and it's mostly accepted. And it's just when we're looking at it in a different way, maybe we're like, oh, how could they glorify this? But it's no more glorified than something like Boys in the Hood.
Right. And that's why I mentioned Mean Streets, because
Yeah,
if you're thinking of the Scorsese movies, those are like the petty criminals, the street level, the guys who are just trying to get by, right? They're
right.
not the bosses or the rich guys. So yeah, we disagree with the with those critiques of this film, and we're standing by it.
Yeah. And so actually now the last review I have is the most critical. So we can, get a little more into this. Wesley Morris in the Boston Globe was very not positive about this film. He said, set in an arid and packed favela of Rio de Janeiro called City of God, the film spans 3 decades and an extreme body count whose tally rises while your blood pressure is likely to stall. I don't mean to sound blasé or to suggest that if you've seen one pack of young derelict hoods try to assassinate another, you've seen them all. But there's something distasteful in the rote way this film introduces us to 24 hapless, heartless kids and doesn't care enough to make us feel for them. It would rather doll up the slum and memorialize the trigger-happy thugs infesting it. What ought to be devastating and tragic about City of God is discomfiting in its offhandedness. This isn't a movie. It's a soulless pictorial. So I don't agree, as we were just saying, with that perspective. Although I did feel like watching this movie that there's such this barrage of characters that it was hard to get a handle on a lot of them.
I could see that. That's fair, but I mean, it's based on a book, right? So this is kind of and we're telling the story across generations. I think two counterpoints are yes, there's a large body count, and a lot of it seems random. Guess what? That's gang warfare, dude. You know. And the other thing is to say that you didn't feel for any of these kids. I just point to that one scene where little Z tracks down the runts and he puts the two kids next to each other and shoots them both, one in the hand and one in the foot. And that kid is just crying, thinking he's going to die. And then little Z makes, I think it was steak with fries, my favorite of all the nicknames, shoot one of them, right? So he makes another kid go through with it and murder a kid, right? So how I don't know how you can say that wasn't impactful. That was one of the more memorable and emotionally wrought moments of the film, I feel like.
Yeah, that scene is very intense and kind of tough to watch. And I think his point is like, you're right that obviously, yes, in gang warfare, lots of people do get killed. I think maybe his point is that a movie like this should give you more of a sense of who those people are, or so that you can care about them when they get killed. But I mean, if there's dozens and dozens of people getting killed, the movie can't spend time with each one of them and give you their individual personality to make you care. But I did feel that scene aside, and maybe one or two other scenes, I did feel that like I wasn't that emotionally invested, that this movie was more about sort of like cool posturing. And the cool posturing is on the part of the characters in a lot of ways. I mean, Lil Zay, for example, is all about, coming off in a certain macho way or whatever. So that's part of the storytelling, but it did feel a little surfacey to me at times. And I overall, I think this is a good movie. But I can see where a little of that is coming.
Yeah, but I think that's also, this is the recounting of one person's experience in the favela, right? And even with all that violence, he seems to have a very positive reminiscing on it, right? It does seem like he's telling a fable, but like, yeah, my brother was killed and I should have killed the guy who did it, but I didn't. And then it kind of worked out for me. There is a lot of that. So
Right.
I can see what you're saying. The flip side to that is it's like 2 hours and 9 minutes, and it flies by. Like it feels like it does not feel like a long movie to watch.
Yeah, I also felt a little like it was getting a bit repetitive towards the end, but it's not difficult. Like it doesn't feel too long, but I was feeling a bit okay. Let's get done with it a little towards the end. But I mean, overall, I do think it's good, and so I just wanted to kind of present that perspective. Another thing that people mention, and this goes with the background
You should.
on this movie, is Fernando Meirelles, who had a background in advertising, and in fact, I believe still is a partner in a big advertising agency in Brazil, and that this has that kind of slick, including the visual style that we talked about as being so great, is that it almost feels like it has that advertising aspect. And I think in my review that I had originally wrote, which was very positive, I said something that like it feels like it's a commercial for the slum or something like that. And that's part of maybe the tension thematically, that you want it to be like exciting but also dangerous. And so I don't know that these are necessarily bad things, but it's just something interesting.
Well, again, you go, I mean, I brought up Mean Streets, right? And, we're in a poorer part of New York City, and guys just trying to get by, and they love it, and that's their life and they love it. So I see what you're saying. We keep mentioning Meirelles, but Katia Lund gets lost in all this, doesn't she?
She does, and that's a big thing, and that's something that I was interested in looking into with this film, because she, who is credited as the co-director, and it's very specifically credited as like a film by Fernando Meirelles, who is credited as director, and then she's credited as co-director. But she was the one who had the experience shooting in the favelas, who had made documentaries in the favelas, and he recruited her to kind of give him that sense, him coming from this advertising background and wanting to make a film here. He brought her in as someone who could, speak to that authenticity to some degree. So, I mean, she is a very important part of this who gets kind of forgotten. And I mean, that goes along with the legacy of this film and where their careers kind of diverged. And of course, he was nominated for Best Director at the Oscars and she was not. But yeah, we have to acknowledge that she, regardless of what the credit situation is, she's a huge part of making this movie work.
Right, and I agree with you. It's very interesting how, I mean, she still works, and we'll get to that. She works mainly in Brazil, and Meirelles is kind of a worldwide filmmaker at this point.
Yeah, and I mean, not for nothing that he's a man and she's a woman. I mean, I'm sure that certainly played a little part in it, and what people get credit for and what people don't get credit for. But we should make sure to give her the credit because I think she deserves it.
Well, that was why I brought it up, Josh.
Right. I mean, and obviously after all these years, if she's acknowledged on Awesome Movie Year, I mean, I feel like that's all she ever really wanted out of it, right?
Yeah, Dave set up the interview with Katia Lund.
Working on it.
So I know, as I mentioned, I reviewed this when it came out, so I certainly saw it in the theater. And Jason, I feel like this is a movie where you're going to tell me that we saw it together, and I forgot.
I don't remember. This might have been a Blockbuster, rental for me. This was definitely one I heard of. This might have been when I was living in LA and we just rented it, or who knows. But it was, man, it blew me away the first time, and I really loved watching it again this time.
Yeah, I really I gave it 4 stars, like I said in my initial review, and I think I was a little cooler on it this time, but I still think it's really good and generally holds up. I mean, I hadn't seen it since I first watched it back then in the theater. So, Dave, did you see this when it came out?
I'm sure I did, but it's one of those movies that I just really didn't remember much about it, just that I really liked it at the time.
And this would be a cool one to see in the theater with all the spectacular visual elements along with that really great soundtrack, that kind of soul and funk soundtrack that he's got going cross countries, American and Brazilian.
Yeah, and I did see it in the theater. I mean, I saw it at a press screening, I'm sure. So that probably contributed to my sense of being impressed with it. That makes a difference in a lot of times. So any other background you want to mention on this, Jason?
Yeah, Josh, you mentioned biggest film in Brazil, 10.3 million made there, 7.5 in the US. We should mention it is based on a book by Paulo Lins, and the screenwriter who adapted is Braulio Mantovani, whose name I'm sure I did not pronounce well there.
You made him sound Italian.
Italian
so
fella.
That's something.
Braulio Mantovani. Braulio Mantovani de Brazil. I don't know. So, okay, you mentioned some of the accolades. It was the #1 of the year from Empire magazine. Pace magazine named it the #1 movie of the decade. And out of 84 award nominations, it won 55, including a BAFTA for editing, which I think it deserved. And Josh, Las Vegas Film Critics Society, Best Foreign Film, back when you guys weren't a sham.
Nice. I don't think I don't know if I was in the Las Vegas Film Critics Society at the time. This has come up now in several episodes for this season. I'm glad you're keeping up with the Las Vegas Film Critics Society.
Someone has to document when it meant something before they let Dave in.
Yeah, before they let me in too. So really, at the height of its
no, you weren't part of the downfall. Yeah, you were on the level.
Oh, thank you.
You're okay, Josh.
I appreciate that. Well,
although now, since you helped Dave get in, not so much.
Oh, my credibility is shot. All right. Well, on that note, we'll come back in a moment and talk about our general thoughts on City of God. Welcome back to Awesome Movie Year. In this episode of our season on the films of 2003, we are talking about our foreign film pick, City of God by Fernando Meirelles and Katia Lund, as we mentioned, making sure to give her credit as the co-director. And we've been talking a lot about already what we liked about this film. And Jason, I think you like it a bit more than I do, although I like it too. And so, what is your favorite thing about this movie? Or we've kind of we know we've covered a lot already.
I mean, it just got me right away, and I remembered liking it, but I couldn't have told you much about it because I hadn't seen it since my first watching. But I just the word that comes to my mind is kinetic, and it just feels like there's such an energy to it, and it's a very natural energy, and everything pings off of each other. And I just loved it. It just felt really good. I like the storytelling. I understand if you feel if certain characters were underdeveloped, especially female characters here, you know. But I think in the end, it just, and I also think like it's a risk to do something like, hey, we're going to go from the late 60s through the 70s through the 80s and tell different stories with different characters and have the same level of effectiveness all the way through. Because really, it's Rocket, you know, our main character who we see who wants to become a photographer, and then some of the guys he grew up with. You know, you mentioned Little Zeh and Benny and then Blackie, right? Those are the kind of the ones he grew up with, and they all went their different ways. But I thought it was interesting from the tender trio at the beginning all the way through the runts at the end, Josh.
Yeah. Yeah, I did feel like it got a bit repetitive, that it tells these different stories, but they're all kind of the same story, which I think is also part of the point,
Yeah.
that it's this cycle of violence in the favela. And, you know, at any given moment, there's some big gangster who thinks he's the biggest thing ever, but he just gets replaced by the next one. And it doesn't matter. And the world doesn't pay attention. But I think from a storytelling perspective, a little, especially in the final segment that's about the war between Lil Zay and Carrot, the two rival
Ned.
Right, and Knockout Ned and Carrot, who are the sort of rival drug gang. That I felt like I got a little drawn out, and I found myself in that segment being more interested in Rocket, who of course is like the only character in the movie who is a good person and likable in any way. The one who gets out, and the one who is a real person who is partially the inspiration for this story. And I know that's not really what the movie is about. It's about the gangsters. And some of, at least one review, I can't remember where, talked about how Rocket was the least interesting thing in the movie. But I guess I just felt like the gang action at a certain point, it just kind of was monotonous in a way. But I'm being the critical one here, but overall, I think this is a really good movie.
Yeah, and that's fine. I disagree with you that he's the only likable one. I understand if you want to say like he's the only quote unquote good guy in the movie, but I mean Benny is very charismatic and likable, and I think he shows that the character. You see that with the character in that he's able to hang out with all those different groups. And I also think Knockout Ned as this kind of like anti-folk hero was an interesting character that you're, because Little Zed at this point you're just like, dude, someone take this guy out, right? You know, so you're rooting for that at that point in time. So I would disagree with you on that part. But yeah, I get it. I mean, there's a lot of violence, and I thought it was done. Each part was done, had its own individual stamp on it. So to me, it was okay. Like it didn't feel like it was repetitive. It just felt like whether it was heightened or the next thing, it worked for me. And you're right. Each thing, the story was they were telling the origins, right? So when you started with the Tender Trio, this is how they became that, and this is how Little Dice became Little Zen, and you know. So I get what you're saying. Like maybe we went back in time, but since they're all like kind of folk heroes, they all have an origin, which I think was kind of the point of telling the story that way.
Yeah, and you're right that there are some more characters who are somewhat likable. They may not be, redeemable or whatever, but Benny is, despite being a criminal, and at least he gets to a point, he has an arc where he gets to a point where he realizes, I want to get out of this. I want a different kind of life. And of course, there's the tragedy that he is never able to do that. And Knockout Ned is also sort of a tragic figure who does get out and has a legit job and is on his way to something else and gets pulled back into this world and sort of loses his soul in the process. So, I mean, those are complex characters, and that's what makes a movie interesting. I did feel like in terms of the sort of folk hero aspect or the idea of showing all these origin stories, I felt like by the end of the movie, I barely remembered the Tender Trio or whatever, which is the first story that we'd seen this sort of cycle so many times that they'd already sort of left my mind.
Maybe that's part of the point, because you
Yeah,
said it's a cycle, right? And it's a vicious and violent cycle. And, if we're talking about redeemable, like that's in our mind as a viewer sitting in our nice middle class neighborhoods, right? Like these
sure.
guys, a lot of them have no chance to get out. So it's like, I have to do this to survive. Or, if I want any type of comfort in my life, this is what it takes. So it's tough to put those parameters on there. But again, I understand the criticism. I'm just saying, for me, all that stuff works, and I think because that's part of the story that's being told.
Right. And I think you can draw a line, and I think the movie does draw a line with some of these characters where it's what you just said, that we see how they have no choice and this is all that they can do. And even Rocket occasionally has to get involved in some illegal activity in order to get by. Um, Versus someone like Lil Zay, who is clearly just a psychopath. And
Right. Not just to get by. Remember at one point he tried to become a gangster and it went horribly wrong. Like every holdup he was going to do, he couldn't go through it, or something else happened that prevented it from it. And he realized, like, oh, I'm not a gangster. Right. But
right.
it definitely crossed his mind at one point.
Yeah, and I think it's that he, even as the character in the movie who is most dedicated to not being a gangster and to doing something else with his life, even he is stuck at certain points thinking this is the only thing that I can do.
Yeah. Now we're talking a lot about the violence and the gangster aspect, but I loved seeing the other stuff too, man. The hippies hanging at the beach was a lot of fun. uh, Benny and Paolo on their little bike race, was fun. And Benny's going away party is like one of the great party scenes that I remember, like something like a 24-hour party people, where you watch it and you're like, man, this is just done so well. You remember it years later. Like, I'm going to remember that scene for a while. I think that was tragic ending to the scene, but really it showed like a real just kind of joy and warmth, and it's unfortunate how it ended, but it showed a real glimpse into how a community can come together for someone.
Yeah, that is a really good scene. Although I feel like the best thing about that scene, I mean, best or the most riveting part of that scene is when it turns tragic and there's this great, like really tense building of
Yeah.
suspense as Blackie is coming in to the party and he's all still bloody from having been beat up and he's out for revenge against Lil Zay. And in the meantime, Lil Zay is terrorizing Knockout Ned and trying to get at his girlfriend, and everyone is converging around Benny, and things are gonna, even if you haven't seen the movie before, this isn't gonna end well. Things don't end well for these characters really, and especially also in a gangster movie, whenever any gangster is like, "I'm gonna get out," it's like, "Oh, he's dead."
Yeah. Right.
So something's gonna happen, but I think the movie really builds that suspense and really keeps you on edge there because you don't know exactly what's going to happen, just something very bad. And it builds and builds and builds until it like explodes in that moment. So I think that's good. As good as the party scene is, that's what's good. As good as the sort of background and the flavor of the neighborhood is, the violence is what makes this movie.
Yeah, of course. I'm just saying you can't. There are other elements too that are. It's not all violent, right? It might be 94% violent, but the other
Yeah.
6% is pretty good too. But you're right, Josh. That first of all, Little Zay, you see like kind of just what he can't get a girl to dance with him, so he has to bully someone else, right? And it's just it's cruel and it's sad and it just sucks, right? And then like you said, something bad is going to happen, but the way that's shot with like those flashes at that point, the lighting is strobed and everything, which especially for someone like you who is very adamant at calling people on like style for just style's sake, right? That could have
Right.
gone
Yes.
wrong. That could have gone wrong, but you're right. It added just a ton of tension and it really led to you holding your breath, even though you probably knew the outcome you were rooting against.
Right. I think that is, and that's a hallmark of a great scene like that, where even if you know what's going to happen, and whether you know what's going to happen just because you know what happens in these movies, or you've actually seen it before, you're still sort of, like you said, holding your breath, like, oh no, wait, maybe he's going to get away. Maybe that's not what's going to happen right now. Even though it is. And there's a tragedy, but there's also, if you haven't seen the movie before, or you don't remember, you might think like, well, maybe Benny's going to die, or maybe Knockout Ned is going to die, or maybe Rocket's going to die. I mean,
Or
he's
Little
so innocent.
Zed,
Right.
right?
Well, no, Lil Zay is not going to die there because he's the invincible bad guy. He can't get his comeuppance.
No,
yet.
but that's the point, is that like he was the one who took out other people to become Little Zay. So someone could have easily have taken him out to become the next crime boss, right?
True. I mean, and that does eventually happen at the end of the movie, but I think at that point, that was not what I was expecting. I would have been surprised.
But you probably didn't expect it to go, like you said, from the Tender Trio over to Little Zay the way that it did, right in the middle of a movie, right?
Right. I mean, I remembered, from having seen it before, I remembered Lil Dice is going to become Lil Zay and is going to be this big crime lord, in a vague sense. So I knew that was going to get there eventually. And as scary as Lil Zay is, in a way, the kid, Douglas Silva, who plays Lil Dice, is scarier because he's this like kind of cute kid who just like loves murdering people.
Yeah, he's laughing
nuts.
and enjoying it, and it's a little wild over there. A little wild. You have a favorite Lil, Josh? Of all the Lil rappers out there, you got a favorite Lil?
I am not really a listener of hip hop, surprisingly. So
Not a fan of Lil Durk?
no, see, I don't know. I don't even know who that's a lesser known Lil, I think. I know Lil Wayne.
No, I think Lil Durk is a huge Lil. It's
Is
just
he
that
right
you don't.
now?
Yeah, you don't know the Lils right now. You knew Lil Jon and Lil Wayne, but not
Right.
Lil Durk or Lil Peep.
Lil Yachty.
Oh, you know
Yeah.
what? I do know Lil Yachty because sadly I have seen How High 2 starring Lil
There you
Yachty.
go.
Lil Peep died, I think.
Yes, he
And
did.
that's a
He
bummer.
did.
Yeah, I think you're right.
This is an important digression we got going.
I just was wondering if you had a favorite of the Lils, Dave.
My favorite is Lil Dice because he's so scary.
I like
That's true. He is
Little
really
Kim,
scary.
even though she's not Lil.
Yeah, well, she I feel like we're going between little and Lil, and these are different. It's key difference here.
It's true.
Did you have a favorite nickname? I said I like steak with fries. Getting back to the movie, that was that was
that's
a fun
important
one.
stuff. Yeah, that is a good one, and it's interesting because, like, of course, these are all translated into English, and some of them I was looking just scanning through Wikipedia, and some of them are translated very literally, and some of them are not. And I thought it was interesting that Knockout Ned, and I didn't realize this, but I think the idea there is that he's a knockout, as in like good looking.
Heartthrob, yeah.
Right. And I kept thinking of it knockout as in being violent, knocking people out. But either way, that's not, it's actually chicken is
Chicken Manny, right?
Right. But which in Brazil is slang for someone who's good looking, apparently. But which I think in America, we would think of that more as like a peacock or something, if you want to keep with the bird analogy. But of course, a chicken, as we know of it in English, is not what they're going for there. So it's a weird balance. But I kind of like that Knockout Ned. It makes him sound like a boxer or something. So
and he was I mean, he was a marksman in the military, like the number one marksman of his unit, right? So they talk about that. The one group we haven't really talked about, although we kind of mentioned it, were the runts, which we should at least bring up, in that these gangsters get younger and younger, and then by the time the runts are kind of running amok in the favela, they're just little kids, 8 to 12 years old, right? And eventually little Zay gives them guns, and that was a mistake on his part, but it's the cycle goes, but now it's younger people taking over and everything.
Right. And I think that's the thing with Lil Dice in the earlier segment, when he's notable because he's the only little kid who's super violent that way. And by the time we get to it being 15 years later or whatever it is, by the time the movie ends, it's this whole gang of little kids, because that's all they know is how to be violent. And they just kind of laugh and have fun when they're planning about who they're going to kill and which of their rivals. And of course, they still have little kid versions of rivalries, but now they're going to go kill these people because of it.
They have like hit lists, and like their hit lists kind of range between like real gangs and like, oh, that guy looked at me the wrong way, let's kill him, right? So it just shows you how violence is so normalized in a lifestyle like that.
Right, right. You mentioned that the female characters in this movie aren't really developed, and I mean, I don't know how much there really is to say. I mean, there's Angelica is the one female character who maybe gets the most amount of screen time and the most of a character who is kind of Rocket's crush that he briefly gets to kiss on the beach before she becomes Benny's girlfriend, and then she has a very a tragic moment when Benny is killed. But even she is really just her function is sort of as a plot device to move between the male characters. So I'm sure that's a realistic reflection of the gang life here, that there weren't women leading these gangs or as part of the gangs or whatever. But it's also, especially for a movie co-directed by a woman, it does seem to be missing an aspect of that wider portrait of the favela that you're talking about.
Yeah, and if you want to go back to Goodfellas, we know the Lorraine Bracco character is a really well-formed character, or Casino Sharon Stone, right? But I think that Angelica character, it would have been interesting to see what happened to her after all that, right? Because she was this hippie, and they were going to go to the farm together, and the tragic ending, and not only that, she couldn't like even stay and hold him as he, died. She had to leave because she was going to end up as a victim of violence. And it would have been interesting to check in with her at the end, I think.
Right. I mean, once her sort of function is done and Benny is killed, she just disappears from the movie and we don't see her again.
Yeah. The filmmakers do a good job of presenting her as that crush the first time you see her on the beach, and Rocket's a teenager, and they give you that real sense of like that teenage kind of wistfulness and longing, and that kind of desire.
Right. Yeah. And Alice Braga, who's the actor, she does well with what she's given in that small role, and clearly was someone that people were drawn to in this film. The American poster for City of God has the image of her kissing Rocket on the cheek, which is not representative of the film at all, but obviously something that marketers or whoever saw as like
she does kiss him on the cheek though.
I mean, she does, but it's certainly not like what the movie's about.
Hey, Josh, speaking of marketing, I loved one of the catchphrases which they ran with, which was, if you run, the beast catches you. If you stay, the beast eats you. I thought that was really kind of telling of the movie without hitting you over the head with it.
Right. It gives you that sense of the way that people are trapped, and no matter what, they can't get out, and the lack of choices they have, and how remarkable it is that Rocket, or the real guy that Rocket is based on, actually did achieve this level of success.
Yeah. And Josh, one thing we didn't say, because we're talking about a lot of really high points of this, we got to give credit, one, to the actors, and two, to the directors. Most, like 99% of the cast was not actors. They were locals in the favela, right? So that's pretty amazing to get this level of performance out of all of them, from that little kid who's crying all the way through little Zay. I think like they all just hold their own here,
Yeah, it is impressive. And there's plenty of movies where they cast in that way with non-actors that are authentic to whatever the subject matter of the movie is. And that doesn't always work out. And I think You're right. Credit to these actors, but also credit to the directors who spent a really long time in workshops with these actors, sort of crafting their performances and developing their characters, in part inspired, I think, by some of their aspects of their own lives. I was watching, just before we started recording, the documentary City of God 10 years later, and they have some kind of camcorder footage of the early rehearsals for this film, which are from like 2000. I mean, they spent, I think, maybe a year or more just working with these actors to kind of develop them into an ensemble so that they could pull off what's in the movie. So certainly that's a huge aspect. As much as beautiful as the visuals are, the actors do bring those characters to life.
Yeah. Yeah. And we've talked about it. Like, I mean, had this one cinematography or editing, I think the editing is pretty brilliant in this movie. Then I think those were both deserved. But I mean, I think, watch the movie. It's a great movie.
It is a really good movie. And as much as I've been like I said, I've been critical of certain aspects of it. Overall, I think this is a really, really good movie. And I'm glad I got to see it in a theater way back when, and I think it would be a cool thing to see in a theater again someday, because it does have that immersive quality to it with the images that would be great to see on a big screen. So should we rate this one out of 5 runaway chickens maybe that we see at the beginning and that sort of bookend the movie?
Yeah, talk about some splice cut editing there, huh? So
Yeah.
it gets 4 runaway chickens from me. I remember you said you gave it 4 in your original review, and I probably would have as well. It stays at 4 for me. It's just a pleasure to watch.
Yeah, I feel like I've gotten stingier with the stars over time. So I'm going to give it 3.5 this time. But still, again, very good. Worth seeing. If people haven't seen it, you should certainly check it out. So, Dave, how do you want to rate this?
I'm going to give it 4 runaway chickens.
All right. So, a good movie worth seeing. So, we will come back then in a moment and talk about the legacy of City of God. Welcome back to Awesome Movie Year. In this episode of our season on the films of 2003, we've been talking about our foreign film pick, City of God. And legacy-wise, I mean, this movie was a huge pop culture phenomenon in around the world, but especially I think in Brazil, where it was unique in that there weren't a lot of big hit movies that came out of Brazil at this time. And so this was the thing. And it was followed up with this TV series that was set in the same area with different characters, although with a couple of the same actors. Douglas Silva, who played Lil Dice, is one of the main stars of it, called City of Men, which was then itself made into a movie called City of Men in 2007. Have you seen any of that stuff, Jason?
No, and then to add on to that, City of Men had another sequel, I think also with the same name that lasted another. So the original City of Men was 4 seasons, and then the movie came, and then they did another sequel based on that, also called City of Men, that was also 2 seasons. I would be interested in seeing all of those.
Yeah, I saw the City of Men movie when it came out. I mean, the TV series is available now, I think, to buy digitally or on DVD. But at the time, it wasn't shown in the US. But the movie was shown and was sort of marketed I think, as like, oh, this is the sequel to City of God. Forget about the show that we didn't bring here. And it came out in theaters here. And I saw it, at least I vlogged it, a date and whatever on Letterboxd, but I remembered like nothing about it.
Well, I don't know. I knew that the TV show was a huge hit. Like it averaged like 35 million viewers or something, some crazy numbers. So if you don't remember anything about it, that the movie, that's probably not a good sign. We know it wasn't the same directors, right?
Right. They did. Meirelles and Katia Lund directed, I think, some individual episodes of the show, but they were not the directors of the movie. I forget who it was, but right. I mean, and it didn't have the same impact. I think whoever released it in the US, I'm sure marketing wise, they wanted to piggyback on this movie that had been very popular a few years earlier, but it didn't have that level of impact, although it was generally well reviewed. And I think I liked it. I just don't remember much detail about it. So, but
well, that's great, Josh. That's really good information for our listeners.
Right. That is available, more easily available to watch here in the US now than the TV series is. And as we were saying, I mean, the sort of co-director aspect, Fernando Meirelles, who was already a very successful advertising creative in Brazil, this launched him into this big international career that still exists. I mean, he was nominated again for an Oscar, I think, for The Constant Gardener, which I think is quite a good spy thriller with Rachel Weisz. And just in 2019 made The Two Popes, which Jason, I think we saw that movie together.
We did not. I've never seen it.
Oh, Thanks, I saw it with Dave.
That was me.
That was Dave.
Yes.
That's hurtful to both of us. I guess
right.
He's got another one coming out called Nemesis, maybe. And then Joint Venture looks interesting. That's his TV show about kind of marijuana growers in Brazil. Right.
And so as much as he's made these Hollywood films, he has retained a foot in Brazil and made that show in Brazil for HBO. And I haven't seen that either. I think it's available. It was, HBO Latin America, but I think you can watch it on HBO Max here in the US. So. And The Two Popes, it's okay. Dave, do you want to weigh in on The Two Popes?
It's okay.
All right. I wanted to give you a chance because I've totally negated your existence.
No, it was a funny movie. I just it was surprising that it got as much attention as it did, but I guess it has the pedigree of all these other nominations.
Right.
Mantovani went on to write another major franchise in Brazil, Elite Squad. Which I've never seen, but I mean, there's many chapters to the Elite Squad, I think, or at least 2 or 3.
I haven't seen it either, but that certainly was a massive hit in Brazil and worldwide. And the director of at least that first one, Jose Padilla, also went on to do some Hollywood stuff. I think he directed the RoboCop remake, I want to say. So that was certainly a launching pad for people there in Brazil. And then Katia Lund, as we mentioned, didn't really get the credit maybe that she deserved for this film. She was not nominated for the Oscar as Best Director. And she still works. She does a lot of documentary work, which is what she had been doing before this and why she was kind of recruited to participate. But it was interesting to me. I read there was an article in The Guardian in 2004 at the time that this was nominated for an Oscar, which, from the perspective of here's this person who was overlooked. And I wrote a quote from her because I thought it was interesting. She said, "I know I was there working with Fernando to construct the vision and style of this film. If I was not directing, what was I doing?" So, she justifiably, I think, was a little resentful to not get this credit.
Yeah. And I think you probably hit the nail on the head when you wondered if her being a female had something to do with it.
Yeah. And there was another bit in that where she talks about when they went to Cannes and people looked at her as the babysitter for the kids, the kid stars and, not the director. And that there's certainly a gendered perspective going on there. So it's unfortunate. Not that Meirelles, not to deny him his credit either, because obviously he's very, very talented and went on to direct movies on his own that are good. But, the balance.
They both deserve the credit, it sounds.
Right.
Yeah. That's what it should be. As for the actors, different levels of success, they all went on to act in other things or many of them did. And like you said, I think a lot of them appeared in City of Men. Rocket, Alexandre Rodrigues. It was on Wikipedia, but they said he's driving Uber now. So that's kind of a bummer. But
yeah, it's rough. And as I mentioned, I didn't get through all of it, but I was watching the City of God 10 years later documentary, which is already now 9 years old. But even in that, and they're catching up with a lot of these actors. And some of them, like you said, are doing, are having decent acting careers in Brazil. But there were quite a few of them, especially some of these actors who played really small parts, who had been arrested, who, because they lived in the favela and this was their life and they just kind of went back to it.
Right. There was one that they couldn't track down, if I'm not mistaken.
Maybe I haven't gotten to that part yet.
Yeah.
And there's a really kind of ironic moment where probably either Alice Braga or Seu Jorge, or however you pronounce his name, which I'm sure I'm mangling, are the most successful ones to come out of this. Jorge, who played Knockout Ned. And in this documentary, he's staying in this fancy hotel because he's performing this huge concert because he's a musician is what he's known for more than as an actor, although he's successful as both. And in the hotel working as a bellboy is the kid who played the kid who got shot in the foot. And they have this moment together.
True?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Seu Jorge is a pop samba icon out there.
Yes.
Sounds right? And Alice Braga doing really well with Queen of the South on Netflix.
Yeah, and she's been in a ton of blockbuster movies. She was just in New Mutants.
Yeah, and some very well-regarded Brazilian movies, Lower City and Cabeca Premio. So I've not seen either of them, but she like you said, she makes the most of her screen time, and you could see she's got more in her, right?
Right. And she's really, she went from this to I Am Legend with Will Smith, and really just her career took off. And Seu Jorge also, he is mainly known as a musician, but he does act. I just saw him in some random tiny American indie film about a Jewish kid who becomes a chef. And he's the kid's chef mentor.
What's that called?
It's called Abe, with one of the kids from Stranger Things. It was all right. And of course, Jason, I don't know why you didn't want to mention Wes Anderson. One of the biggest things that Seu Jorge is known for is being in The Life Aquatic with Steve Zissou and doing all these Portuguese language covers David Bowie songs. I mean, I think that introduced him to American audiences as much as City of God did.
And honestly, I would just listen to an album of him doing Portuguese covers of David Bowie songs and be happy with that.
I'm sure you could. I'm sure that exists. But yeah, that's quite a moment. It's like I said, I didn't get all the way through it, but it's very basic. It's just kind of like, here's this person and what they're doing, and here's this person and what they're doing. But the contrast, of the levels of success and where the people are in their lives, is kind of interesting. They talk about how little they all got paid because, of course, no one knew that this was going to be a major hit. And
right.
Alexandre Rodrigues, who you mentioned later on, maybe driving for Uber and is really the main star of the movie as Rocket, he said that he was offered the chance to have a percentage of the box office and turned it down. And
right.
Mm-hmm.
I think that happened with Little Zay too.
Yeah. So, but interesting kind of footnote to check out related to this. And any other legacy things you want to mention here?
Well, I think the other thing is, like you said, it's influential in that you see a lot of movies that kind of mimic either the style or the color plates of it, and just kind of the rhythms of it. And we've mentioned Scorsese. I also think of Steven Soderbergh, with something like Traffic, kind of washing out those colors there. But it's just go watch the movie. It's great.
Yeah, it is. It is quite a good movie, and on HBO Max at the moment that we're recording this. So if people want to check that out, and that's City of God, and that is this episode of Awesome Movie Year. Check us out on social media.
Social media, guys. We are at awesomemovieyear.com, Awesome Movie Year on Instagram and Facebook, Awesome Movie Pod on Twitter. I'm at Jason Harris Comedy on Facebook and Instagram, Jay Harris Comedy on Twitter. My website could be murdered in a slum. Go for jason.com.
Yeah, mine wouldn't be far behind. JoshBellHatesEverything.com does have some stuff there. Check it out, maybe. Also, Josh Bell Hates Everything on Facebook and at Signal Bleed on Twitter. And you can listen to our producer, David Rosen's awesome podcast, Piecing It Together.
Check out Piecing It Together wherever you listen to podcasts, and you can follow us on social media at Piecing Pod. And don't forget to check out our Produced by David Rosen Patreon that combines content for Piecing It Together, Awesome Movie Year, my music career, and maybe a bunch more as we continue to grow some more subscribers.
And Dave is ripping us off on the Patreon, much like the filmmakers ripped off Rocket in this film.
He's not giving us a cut of the box office. We do still have, if you haven't checked out our 1984 bonus episode on Purple Rain, that's available on Patreon. Give that a listen. And give a listen to our next episode. What are we going to talk about, Jason?
Josh, it's my pick from 2003. I think a movie with big stars that might have been overlooked and a big director, and it's called Matchstick Men.
So tune in next time for Matchstick Men, and thanks for listening to Awesome Movie Year.
Thank you for listening to Awesome Movie Year. Make sure to follow Awesome Movie Year on Facebook, at Awesome Movie Pod on Twitter, and at Awesome Movie Year on Instagram. And if you like the show, review us and rate us with 5 stars on Apple Podcasts.
An All Points West production, produced by David Rosen in Las Vegas.